awesome.
Yeah, I like Ricky Gervais's interpretation of the ending, which is that the big one ate them all.
All right, that's pretty good too. All right. Well, anyway, I don't know the Reddit button. That is a genius move of an April Fool's joke.
Yeah, it was pretty.
Well, but it's not a joke. Again, that's the whole point.
No, it created
it's
some
just cool.
real tribalism too between people who had clicked at different times. It was a whole thing for like a week.
That's just a study in how people adapt online. A Reddit study of
the fool was
human
on us.
psychology.
We're the
That's it. There it is. You figured it out. All right, I think we're coming in live right now. For everybody tuning in, we're live on Facebook and YouTube right now. This is Close to the Metal. This is our computing podcast. We go live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time and talk about specific computing products, and we want you to be a part of this as well. And today, we're going to be talking about the Ryzen 5 processor line, and it just came out. We've got a bunch of reviews on it. We want to discuss that, and overall kind of talk about, I guess, the overriding theme that we put out here on Facebook is AMD is really going at Intel, and is this enough to make you switch? I know that may be kind of a bold question, but I want to see what people think about that. If you have a choice, with what AMD is doing and really coming out with these new lines. And we're going to talk about that, so put your comments, put your questions in there. We're going to go in depth and get a good review of this. I'm Greg Nibbler. Let's talk to our panel here. To my right.
I'm Brad Burke.
It is Brad Burke.
Matt Smith.
And indeed, Matt Smith. I'm just repeating your names back to you to make sure that you're aware that
Yes.
what that was.
That's
yes.
good.
Glad I got that.
Correct. All right.
My identity is confirmed.
We have verified the facts.
Ooh.
It is proven they are who they say they are. All right. Let's talk about this. Ryzen 5. The Ryzen 5 series. Brad, I think we should go to you first because your exuberance over these is clearly displayed in the article that you wrote about of your review. But maybe let's talk about Ryzen in general, what they've been doing just here as of late with this new line. Or AMD with this Ryzen line.
I think the big kind of overarching plot to this is that the last run of AMD processors, Bulldozer, really focused on increasing the core count, didn't focus on bringing in modern features or focusing on an efficiency per core, and that led to really good pricing and really low pricing, but not very competitive performance, I think, in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah.
And so Zen was a chance for AMD to really start over, clean slate, work from scratch, and build something that was a modern feature set, modern chipset, and group of processors, and especially to, for whatever reason, they decided to bump the core count, to really push these Ryzen 7 chips into the 8-core, 16-thread, massive, kind of chips. And that's something that they were able to provide at a price point that Intel was not. That was sort of the start to this, was that they put out these chips that had more cores, when most people were focusing on this 4-8 construction, whereas Intel charges you, like $500 just to get that entry level more than 4-core chip.
And so that's definitely one way where they're competing with them. Then,
yeah,
giving you more cores.
Right.
What that means, we'll get into that here in a little bit too. Just whether that more cores equals better. We'll talk about whether that is. But yeah, so that's one of
that was their trajectory. With Ryzen was to try and start beating Intel in places where they weren't competing, which is kind of the same thing that they were doing with the RX 480. Nvidia put out these big graphics cards at the $300 plus price point, and AMD said, we're going to put out a $200 card. We're going to undercut you. We're going to compete somewhere where you're not even trying.
Okay. All right, and so that
started with the 7 series, the 1700X, the 1700, the 1700X, and the 1800X.
Those came out, I think, beginning of March.
Yeah,
right around there.
March.
For those ones, and so they're continuing this release of this whole Ryzen series, and now we have the mid-range, the mid-range ones that have come out.
The Ryzen 5. And I'm not sure where this
which,
3,
by the
5,
way,
7
this Ryzen 5. This rolls off the tongue so much better than Ryzen 7.
It really does. Yeah,
that is all you need to know. Go buy Ryzen 5. They'd be like, hey, I got my Ryzen 5. Ryzen 5.
That's it. That's today's show. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep.
All right, so the Ryzen 5, 1500X, and 1600X.
Those are specifically, the chips that we reviewed.
Okay. And there's more than that came out in the Ryzen 5 line?
Yes.
Okay.
There's 4.
There's 4
of them total. All right, but we're specifically going to focus on the 1500X and 1600X more.
Yes.
As far as that is. All right. And again, if you have questions about any of these, please drop those in on Facebook and YouTube, and I'll make sure that we get to that as we go through kind of analyzing what AMD's Ryzen line in general, and specifically the Ryzen 5 line processors that we're going to be talking about right now, and whether or not this is going to be enough to persuade some people to choose AMD over Intel. They're really trying to compete with them. It seems like for the first time in a long time, they've actually got a really good product out, and maybe we should talk about that right now. The Ryzen 5 1600X line.
So that's actually
AKA
speaking of
Brad's
great
favorite
products. I think this chip is super awesome. Right off the bat, its $220 price point is super impressive. It really, with 6 cores, decent clock speeds. Let me make sure I get this right.
Is it Ryzen 5 600X?
Yeah, the 3.6 big.
249.
Yeah, at 250, so it undercuts the 7700K by about $70, $50 to $70. Actually trading some blows with it in a number of our tests in our benchmarks, which is no small feat. I mean, that is a chip that we really like. The 7700K was sort of the flagship. Like, buy this chip if you have. If you're building a high-end PC, this is the one to go with. Whether everybody needed that or not, I think is a different question. I think a lot of people could benefit from that i5, which is kind of what brings us to the Ryzen 5. That 1600X is 3.6 gigahertz base clock, 6 cores, 12 threads, and that ends up being a massive advantage for it over the i7 in multi-core tests. That it still beats it out in single speed, but you get into this 6-core area, you can start multitasking, and if you're using software that's well optimized, that's using a well-distributed workload, you see a huge performance benefit. The question is, do you need those cores?
Yeah.
Are programs
More
often
cores.
using more than 4 cores? And right now, I mean, no. I think that's sort of the, most of the tests, we see these kind of differences because we're running benchmarks that are specifically designed to spread out their workload or to focus their workload on a single core's maximum speed.
Yeah.
But in everyday applications, in gaming especially, these games aren't built to use more than 4 cores.
So, I mean, essentially, you don't really even use the 2 extra cores.
Well,
you wouldn't need them.
You can.
Well, it's kind of a tricky argument, right? Because you have, you most of your programs you aren't going to use all 6 cores, 12 threads.
Yeah.
You're sitting there, you're doing your web browsing, you're doing your document editing, whatever. Most of the things that you use a computer for doesn't matter. So you can say, oh, well, you don't need those extra cores, right? But here's the thing. You don't need the extra performance on the Core i7 either. Because, yes, it blows away the, the per thread performance is a lot faster on the Intel processor. So when it's doing a single thing, okay, we run like a browser benchmark and wow, look at it go. But then are you really sitting on any of these systems thinking, oh, man, if I just had a faster processor, I could open more browser tabs? No, probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. So it kind of ends up being a tricky thing when you're talking about do you need the extra cores? Do you need the extra the extra per core processing power of the Intel chip? The answer is that for those common applications, you don't really need either.
Yeah.
So it's really a matter of what is the specific things that you do that pushes your processor to the limit. And that could be something that does use a lot of cores, or it might be something that doesn't. It depends on what you're doing.
Okay, so it all depends on what your actual usage is, what you're doing with your computer.
Totally.
And whether or not you even take advantage of these things. So just blanketly saying more cores is better or something like that really doesn't apply. It's not a fair statement.
To say more cores is better or that better single thread performance is better in a vacuum, that doesn't really tell you enough to make a decision.
To make that statement.
It depends on now, if you're doing gaming, for instance, then you might want the single thread or, few threads at a time performance more than the multi-core performance, for instance.
So, that's definitely an important part then, to figure out what it is that you're going to be what you're going to be using it for, whether or not you can take advantage. And again, I see a lot of people coming in now here onto YouTube and Facebook talking about AMD Ryzen 5 series versus Intel, and I see some questions coming in. Wanted to just bring up a couple of them really quick. Lurajur says, I generally open 400 plus tabs, so maybe that's
that's
you're a
just random,
400 tab person, but this may actually apply to you then. Let's see, we've got somebody was asking if Ryzen is, let's see, Jeff was on Facebook, is Ryzen following Intel's convention of 357, kind of that line?
They are, as far as we know, and I'm not really sure why that's become sort of the de facto. It's sort of like GPU
Intel's
naming too. We were talking about GPU naming the other day, that it's gotten kind of silly. That's just, it's the 357. Cars do that too, right? Like there's BMW 3 Series and 5 Series, and
Yeah.
Gotta avoid those even numbers. I don't know.
So for some reason,
Although I guess, well, I guess with BMW they've sort of filled it out at this point.
that's true. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like that's why they do it, because it's like, well, if we have a 3, 5, and a 7, then later
You
we
can
can go
sneak
back,
something in.
and we can sneak in a 6 or a 4 or whatever we need to. I also think it might be to prevent confusion between core count and model line. Maybe because
okay.
yeah,
I could see
you're
that.
never, because there are, like, for example, Core i5s. There are dual core Core i5s in laptops and quad core Core i5s and desktops. Maybe I don't know.
Okay.
Or it could just be people, they wanted to go home in the marketing department, and it's been a rough day.
Let's just go with it. Yeah. This is
so
what
who
we're gonna
knows? Who knows?
do. All right. Well, that's wanted to get that question there. Keep your questions coming in. We'll get to those. That everybody has. Okay. So continuing on this, the Ryzen 5 1600X. Brad, where do you want to go next with this?
Well, I think the other thing, like you were talking about, especially when it comes to gaming, because I do think that a lot of the time these chips are going to end up in gaming systems. I think, if you're talking about building an enthusiast machine, a mid-range to high-end enthusiast machine, like 80+% of the time that's a gaming machine. That's just what people are using those for. And in this case, we saw, I think, a lot closer performance to the Intel side with the 1600X. Granted, it's really hard to bottleneck a GPU because your GPU is always going to be your biggest determining factor when it comes to your in-game frame rate. That's just bottom line. So it's kind of more about, is the CPU going to hold back that graphics card? And no, I mean, you could buy an i3 and it's probably going to be fine with most single card solutions. It's not like the GPU is always the bottleneck here. But some games, like we test with Sid Meier's Civilization 6, and that game actually does tend to be a bit harder on processors. And I think what's most remarkable is that the 1600X showed a huge jump over the 1500X. That was a noticeable difference in frame rate there. Civ 6 at 1080p medium detail with an RX 480. It went from 73 frames per second to 78 frames per second. On Ultra, it went from 63 to 65, which doesn't seem like a huge difference. But our test results there ranged anywhere from 60 to 69. A few frames can be pretty telling in that case. Obviously, you get up to when you start using the 90 Ti, we saw that the higher core count Intel's chips still took a strong lead, which is kind of still the trend that we're seeing here. Is that, like Matt was saying, the single thread performance, the per thread performance is still better on the Intel side of things.
Intel is still beating them out on that.
It's like, so with the game performance, with two games we tested are two very different games from each other. One is For Honor, which is an action game that runs on DirectX 11, and the other is Civilization 6, which we ran with DirectX 12 enabled, and that's a strategy game where you have a lot of AI calculations going on in the background. In For Honor, there was hardly any difference at all between any of the chips. And in Civilization 6, there was quite a substantial difference. Now, Ryzen does still come out a little behind in the gaming in Civilization. And when you look at the numbers for Honor, there is actually a little bit, of a few frames per second gap there between it and the Intel chip as well. So...
Is that enough to even notice, though?
No, it's not. It's not. And so you can kind of technically say that, like, the Intel chip, I mean, like, the Intel Core i7 7700K, I think, is still kind of like the supreme gaming chip. Like, if you're building a desktop for gaming and you have your pick of whatever you want, you don't really care about the pricing or whatever, then I think the Core i7 7700K is still the one to get. But... the 1600X is $250. So it's really competing more with the Core i7 7600K. And in that sort of price bracket, it starts to look very competitive. Because it does put out some good gaming numbers. And in the situations where it can use all the cores that it has available to it, then it really starts to take off. In those non-gaming scenarios, and it actually beats the Core i7. So that's a pretty good value argument. You know, you can say, like, you can play your games and you're probably not going to notice the difference. And then when you get into, like, a heavy demanding application, and you will notice the difference.
And I think that's one of the things, too, just to bring up that price point, because that is a fairly good deal. You know, at $250, I think is what they're targeting for that. For that 50,
it's a good deal.
You're looking at 300 to 350, somewhere in there for the i7 7700K. So it's not a huge difference. I think
what's the 7600?
It's 230.
230. Okay, yeah, so about the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's actually pretty good. I mean, it sounds like they're getting closer to really competing. You know, taking Intel head on.
Yeah. And it's worth mentioning on top of that the Ryzen chips have a new socket. They have a socket that AMD says it's going to support through at least 2020. And so when you're building a new system right now, there's kind of that also adds to the value of the Ryzen chip, because if you build a new system based on a Core i7 7700K, you're probably using a socket that is going to be abandoned in the near future. And that means that you are kind of stuck with a motherboard and a chip that you can't upgrade to a new processor anytime soon. So it's going to increase your cost the next time you go around and try and, increase, improve your system. If you're building it yourself. You know, if you're buying from a system builder, then you probably don't care about that because you're probably never going to touch the motherboard.
Right.
But if you're building it yourself, the new platform that's offered by AMD is really compelling. Because it gives you upgrade options. So you could keep that same motherboard, and 3 years from now, you could get the next Ryzen processor.
And you'll still be ready to go right there.
Perhaps see upgrade in performance.
And that's just a good point to bring up too. I'm curious, for people watching on Facebook and YouTube, if you're building computers, if you're a computer builder, that's your hobby or whatever you do, would you consider going to this new Ryzen chip instead of going with an Intel, just for that reason alone? In that you're going to be set for 3 more years. Anyway, just want to put that out there. Go ahead and drop in any questions that you've got. Somebody's already saying yes and no to it, so I'll ask you to clarify.
We have a consensus.
So if you can clarify that, I'll bring that in.
Yeah,
okay.
I do think AMD is sort of banking on this, that if they can start pushing out more cores and start pushing, if they can put those in systems by making competitive chips, that it'll cause software developers to start programming things and optimizing for more than 4 cores. And if they do that, then it forces Intel's hand. Like, this is a thing where they're going to start pushing this market into a new place where it's clear that there's some demand for this. And I think especially the rise of streaming and broadcasting and game recording is a big part of this, in that you can use those 4 cores and you can stress them out, and then you still have some CPU overhead to do your encoding, to do your your downsampling and all this stuff. That these are things that AMD is, I think, is consciously doing more so than Intel right now, where Intel is just sort of like, oh, the 7700K is pretty much the 6700K just again. That this is like, it's the same sort of chip. You can almost guess the TDP and the core count and the clock speeds coming off of it before it comes out each year, and you're probably going to be right. And this is a fundamental shift that AMD is banking on, that they're hoping happens, because it gives Ryzen more value over time. Whether it'll happen or not, I don't know. I mean, I think people have always said, right, like, oh, you'll never need more than 8 megabytes of RAM, and people say, oh, you don't need more than 4 cores, but here we are finding ways to use them. And I think there's definitely value to that, like Matt was saying.
Being ready if it does.
And it gives more value, I think, to the mid-range chips, to say, like, I'm not going to break the bank right now buying, like, the biggest, baddest Ryzen chip, because there are going to be new Ryzen chips in the next couple of years, so I can buy this mid-range one now, save a little cash, and then down the road, if I want to upgrade, I have that option to get that big last upgrade chip bbefore they move on to the new platform.
Okay. A couple of questions coming in, and we're going to go over this a little bit more, too, as far as that. But speaking of overclocking, Laura Dreer, I'm probably not pronouncing your name correctly, but anyway, you're in there. And on YouTube, some people don't overclock at all, and the 1800X is the best chip out there for people who don't overclock. That is what they're stating.
I do feel like I think we're going to move into the Ryzen 7 1700, but I do think that, there is a sort of, with the 1700, 1700X, 1800X, there's sort of you can do it yourself, or you can pay AMD to do it for you sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
There's definitely some binning, I think, happening in those chips, because they all do have the same core count. There's a lower TDP on the 1700, but we saw excellent overclocking headroom on that chip, more so than any of the other chips that we've tested for overclocking, I think the 1700 really, we were able to crank
Yeah.
that thing.
Yeah, that was definitely the standout for overclocking. I think, with the 1800X, like, you get more than out of the box, but you do pay for it, so it's kind of,
Yeah.
we were kind of like, on the 1800X from that perspective, because it felt like from a value, like, standpoint, you were definitely better off with 1700.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to remember also that overclocking is really easy with these chips.
Yeah. So you can do it
So-
without a whole lot of previous
Yeah,
knowledge.
you
around it.
open the Ryzen Master software, you like increase the clock speed, and you
and
set
boom,
it.
you've done it.
And if that is unstable, you run a test to see if it's stable. If it's not, maybe you bump the voltage up a bit. Set it. You do this all in Windows.
Yeah.
Like, it's really easy.
Yeah, that's-
it's like setting your display resolution or something.
Wow.
Like,
So yeah, a lot more people can do this than used to be able to.
Although it does have its trade-offs, because like we said, the 1700, we overclocked the snot out of it on a
The snot out.
a Noctua NH5S, if I remember correctly, like a big old Noctua cooler.
yeah. Ran a
That's
little hot, didn't it?
Yeah. But that said, when we tested the 1500X and the 1600X with their stock cooling, with the coolers they come out of the box with, and when we did that, we found that there already isn't a lot of headroom. That's part of the problem, is that these stock coolers aren't necessarily the most powerful, and that's always kind of been the case. That your stock cooler's your stock cooler, and if you want to overclock, you put something better on there. There's some trade-offs with overclocking these chips. The same way with all of them. They basically come out of the box in normal mode. And in normal mode, they have a base clock and a turbo boost. And it runs at the base clock and it pushes to the turbo boost when it needs to. And then it has, the X means it has extended frequency range. So it'll push even further past its turbo boost if it feels it can, thanks to thermal headroom or extra power it has. Or if it's only using 2 cores, it can kind of like push that a little bit further. And we only saw, like 100 megahertz, 150 megahertz from that XFR. If you turn off, it also comes out of the box. All of our chips came out 100 megahertz higher than their stated base clock, because you plug them in and basically the chip runs a little test and it says, oh, you've got some thermal headroom, you've got some power headroom. I'm just going to go ahead and bump your base clock a little bit.
Okay.
When you decide to overclock the chip in Ryzen Master, you flip the chip into a different mode. You flip it into overclocking mode. Now it no longer has that XFR boost because you're setting your maximum speed and your voltage. Because XFR requires like variable voltage, and you're saying I always want it to run at this voltage or under. So it has less room to wiggle itself using its own sensors and its own sort of optimization techniques, which in the 1600X became a problem. Because it was sort of like we spent this time clocking it, pushing the voltage, tweaking, getting it to a stable point, and then the performance boost was minuscule. It was really narrow, and that's just a factor of already this thing is saying, well, I'm going to push myself to this because I've checked, and that's how well I think I can do. And we weren't able to get. I think it's like I have to check on this, but I think they claim like a 4.1 gigahertz XFR, which is pretty high. We weren't able to get the chip past 4,000 megahertz as a clock speed. So on its own, I imagine it could get, if you only had one core, if you had the premium conditions to get that XFR to fire, you could push past 4.0, and you can't do that otherwise. So it is sort of this trade-off where if you're using the stock cooler, you're probably better off just not touching anything and
just
letting the
letting
chip handle its own thing. And if you are using a better cooler, if you've got yourself an all-in-one liquid cooler or just a nice air cooler, then you might want to take a look at tweaking stuff on your own.
Okay, but otherwise, just stick with the stock.
Unless you get the 1700. If you get the Ryzen 7 1700,
Well, let's talk about that really quick, the Ryzen 1700. And I'm definitely going to hit all the questions that are coming in here. We've got several, so we'll probably have a question session here at the end of the show. But let's talk about the Ryzen 7 1700 before we go on to that. Let's do that. So the Ryzen 7 1700, that came out earlier in March. So we've had some time. People have probably had some time to get used to that if they've purchased that, have been using it. And talking about that, I guess, versus the Intel Core i7.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of interesting that the Core i7 7700K is sort of the rival to both of these chips in some ways. That you're sort of, that the 1600X sort of competes with the 7600K, but I already sort of feel like the Ryzen is a better value there. But the 1700 is the sort of the bottom end of the Ryzen 7 bracket. But as we said before, we suspect that a lot of that is binning. That they're taking the same chips and they're saying these are the ones that don't run quite as well. The 1800X are the ones that are running splendidly. Let's crank those up, throw the XFR on them, throw them out the door at the premium price point. Whereas the 1700 is a little bit lower TDP, and as a result, you can plug it in and you can we were able to push this to just a really, really impressive clock rate. We reached a stable 3.85 gigahertz, which is just below 3.975 that we got with the Ryzen 7 1800X, even though it starts at a much higher clock rate. So we were able to actually get a lot more performance out of it than we thought, to the point that in some of our single core tests, we actually tied the 1800X, and our multi-core tests, we beat it sometimes. So we were actually able to get like really, really competitive performance in a lot of cases out of this 1700 without spending the extra money to go to the 1800X.
Okay. So, and that was actually kind of bringing up what somebody else was talking about too with that 1800X.
Yeah.
Where did they go with that? So you got it out of this one.
Yeah.
All right. Any other comments you want to make on this before we kind of analyze what people would need these chips for?
I do think this is kind of there's sort of a thing going on here that's the same as the Core i5 versus a Core i7, in that for a lot of people, even if the 7700K is sort of that like big bad gaming chip that you really want to put in your build log, the Core i5 7600K is going to be really good enough performance for most users.
Yeah, are you really going to need that high end?
Yeah, and so this is sort of the same thing going on here, where like the Ryzen 1700 it's got this great appeal, and wow, I can overclock it. That's super fun, but the 1600X is going to provide really good competitive performance for a lot of users at a really good price point, and I think that's important. Even if the 1700 does beat it, it's really important that that chip comes in at that price point and finds its way into systems, because once again, I think that's where AMD is targeting. They're targeting a price point that people are buying chips at actively, where they think they can compete. And they competed even in the last generation with the Bulldozer chips by saying there were more cores, and people always bought into it, even when they weren't as efficient cores. They were always like, oh, 6 cores, 8 cores, 10 cores, this is awesome. I'm paying like $85 for this chip. And was like, yeah, but you're not getting nearly the per core performance, and all these problems with games aren't going to use them, and this is a way to just like to push that just a little bit further to kind of come back to reality and say we need to provide the right kind of performance, but then to throw that little extra on top there and say like this is. And then we're going to force Intel's hand. We're going to make us like stand out at this price point, this mid-range price point, by providing 6 real cores and 12 real threads.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you're actually utilizing those cores.
Yes.
In this. Okay.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So again, let's kind of move from this. So talking about if you're just tuning in, kind of starting to wrap it up, but we do want to take some questions from everybody. Talking about AMD's Ryzen series, kind of talking about what they released with the new the 5 line, and then comparing that to Intel, and going in depth with it. So what do you need these chips for? I guess we kind of addressed that. Just to kind of sum that up again, like what would you buy the 1600X for? For general, I mean,
any
it's a great
kind of
general
mid-range enthusiast system, I think it's a really good price
enthusiast
point. For once, because I think before it was sort of, well, if you're spending over $100 on a CPU, go Intel, and if you're spending under $100, you might as well go AMD, get a better value there sometimes.
Right.
And now I think really, even at that $250 price point, it's not an immediate decision. You're not just going, well, I'm spending $1,000 on my PC, so I'm going to spend $250 on my processor, and I'm going to get the i5, and off we go.
Right.
This is a real, like, depending on what you're doing, if you're into the streaming thing, if you're into video editing, if you're into 3D modeling, I don't know, what all these situations could be for, but when you start, if you're looking at really putting a lot of demands on your system, it's definitely something to look at.
Okay.
Outside of the world of gaming.
All right, a couple of questions coming through, I think, kind of about chips in general. We've got somebody asking, have you ever tried P-state overclocking? I'm not sure. I'm just throwing these out there as they come through. I think that's an answer for that. That's a no.
Have you tried the P-state overclocking, Brad?
All right, we'll leave that one. Moving on to the next questions here. As we have
overclocking.
I will look into it.
Okay, Brad will look into it.
It's overclocking right now for hipsters.
That's totally it. Okay, so let's see. Jeff is asking, I switched to Intel about halfway through the initial release of Battlefield 3, and I never had problems with any kind of chugging. I guess he was using AMD systems beforehand, then switched to Intel.
Yeah.
As an Intel user, is that what happened?
Yeah, I would say I probably would fix your problem right there.
Yeah. And he's asking, as an Intel user, what does Ryzen offer that the current generation of Intel chips doesn't give me? Just a lower price point. So would it be worth it for him to go back to an AMD?
It's going to offer you. It's really about the cores and the platform.
Yeah.
Now, if you are sitting there on an Intel chip playing Battlefield and you're fine with what's doing, like you're not having any slowdown, you think the performance is good, then it doesn't offer anything.
It's not
like
really gonna change
we're kind of
anything.
past the point where a new processor is going to offer like a feature that you like have to have. Like it's all about whether or not you need the more the extra performance. And if you're fine with your Intel chip right now, that's good. Stick with it.
Even older generation Intel Core i3 and i5, i3 maybe dicey, i5 chips back to like Haswell. Mm-hmm. You're really not going to bottleneck in most games. As we saw, like Civ, different story. If you're just playing Battlefield and For Honor and Overwatch, like you're going to be totally fine with that. And a modern generation GPU, it's not going to be an issue. These kind of enthusiast chips are for people who are, like I said, who are doing things outside of just gaming. Mm-hmm. They're gaming and doing something, or they're doing something with a high-end program, a professional program that is demanding a lot more in their system.
Right. Let's see. Drew's asking, we may not have an answer for this. How's the overclocking for Linux? Probably don't know.
Don't know.
I don't know. I don't know if there was a Ryzen master for Linux.
I don't think there is.
So you could do it through the BIOS, and it's pretty much the same as far as I've seen on the BIOS. As far as like whether good feature support and stuff, I assume so. I know AMD has been better in the past about supporting Linux, so I assume that this is going to be the same case. They really like to do that, especially with Vulkan 2. They really wanted to support Linux and have been working to do so. So
okay,
yeah, I imagine if you're Linux, this is a better choice. I imagine than Intel.
All right. Okay. Well, let's start to wrap this up. So we're again talking about the AMD Ryzen 1600X, the main one that we were talking about, but just Ryzen in general, and about these chips and whether or not it's worth it to switch from Intel or whether they're really competing with Intel. And we found out a lot of information on that. And there's a great review at Digital Trends right now for the Ryzen 5 1600X, where Brad went really in depth with everything that we've talked about. That you can find out a lot of information right there on that chip especially. And I think to kind of sum it up, you are a fan. Is that correct? Is that a fair statement?
I do. Really, I'm glad to see there be some, more than anything, to see some competition in this field, because it gets boring when you review processors and it's like, oh, the 7700K is coming. Do we need to review it, or can we just like bump our graphs 15% and call it a day? I want there to be something fun here, something to dig into, and this was really something interesting to start comparing and saying, like, are we going to use these cores? Are we using them now? Are software developers going to, It asked a lot of questions that I think are going to have to be answered in the next year or two.
Jay did have one question. Looking for a new CPU for audio production and gaming. My old i7 grinds to a halt with my audio stuff. Is Ryzen a good option? That sounds
Probably.
like
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if it is...
So, I mean, your video production or your audio production equipment software is multi-threaded, then yeah.
Which I believe Audacity does a really good job if that's what you're using.
Yeah.
Does a good job
or
of,
Adobe.
spreading out the workload. Adobe. Yeah, all the Adobe applications, I think, are great multi-threaded.
So it sounds like, that could be a good option for you.
Yeah.
Well, definitely keep on putting questions in here. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, drop your questions on there, and we'll try to make sure we get to those, or drop it on the article at digitaltrends.com. And also, very importantly, subscribe to the audio podcast, because there's a whole audio version of this that comes out close to the metal. Just find it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. We will be there, Digital Trends Podcasts, and this one is close to the metal. And so that way you can check out all the back episodes and make sure that you get it as soon as it comes out for everything that we talk about. And we do this every week live on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific time right here at digitaltrends.com. So make sure to tune in for that. And if you have any, like I said, any other questions, you can always email to podcast@digitaltrends.com. Let us know. If there's a specific topic that maybe you think we should cover, you can email that as well, and we'll see if we can get that into to an episode. I think that's about it. Any final thoughts?
Ryzen 5 1600X. It's a good chip.
It's a good chip.
You should probably buy it.
All right, there we go. And Brad approves.
Yeah.
And that is the final answer. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll be back next week with another episode.
So